Welcome to the CanMed Coffee Talk podcast, where we talk with the leading minds in cannabis science, medicine, cultivation, and safety testing. I am your host, Ben Amaralt. I'm the Senior Marketing Manager at Medicinal Genomics and proud member of the team that puts on the CanMed Summit. Okay, first off, if you are seeing or hearing this episode on the day it drops, February 19th, then today is the final day that you can purchase your CanMed 25 ticket package at the early bird rate. That means that tomorrow, February 20th, prices will jump up $500 on all of our ticket packages. So, if you are planning on joining us in Puerto Rico this June, if you have the dates already circled, then pause this episode, go to canmedevents.com and register right now. And if you are still on the fence, well, I invite you to go to canmedevents.com, check out our speaker lineup, our schedule, and our unique networking events designed to connect you with the leaders who are shaping the industry. We just announced the Genomics Workshop and the Compliance Workshop just last week. Both are half-day workshops featuring interactive panel discussions that tackle some of the biggest topics in the industry, including lab shopping, genome editing, remediation techniques, and breeding for plant and pest resistance, and so much more. Trust me, if you are a lab professional or a commercial cultivator, you don't want to miss these workshops. And if you are a clinician, we've got you covered too. We have a full-day CanMed medical practicum taught by Dr. Bonnie Goldstein, Dr. Dustin Sulak, Dr. Laszlo Mechler, and Nurse Laura Barrett. And that's going to cover all the latest information related to cannabinoid therapeutics. And if you are a clinician, you can earn 6 continuing medical education credits for attending. We have packed so much into this summit, and we have so much more to announce. So go to canmedevents.com now and learn more and buy your ticket today to get $500 off your ticket package. Our guest today is Dr. Staci Gruber. Stacy is the director of the Cognitive and Clinical Neuroimaging Care at McLean Hospital's Brain Imaging Center and an associate professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. Stacy launched Marijuana Investigations for Neuroscientific Discovery, or MIND, in 2014. The first ever program of its kind designed to clarify the long-term impact of medical cannabis use. MIND supports numerous projects that aim to address the impact of medical cannabis on a number of important variables, including cognition, brain structure and function, clinical state, quality of life, pain, sleep, and other health-related measures. As director of MIND, Dr. Gruber has generated major contributions to the field as the first to assess medical cannabis patients longitudinally, first to acquire neuroimaging data in medical cannabis patients, and as principal investigator of the first clinical trial to do a full-spectrum high CBD product, which he specifically formulated to treat anxiety. Additionally, novel clinical trials have been approved and are pending or currently underway. And at CanMed 25, Stacy will share findings from those clinical trials as an oral presenter. During our conversation, we discussed some key findings from the MIND program's longitudinal studies on medical cannabis use, including improved cognitive performance and reductions in pain, anxiety, and sleep disturbances. The ongoing clinical trials the MIND program is conducting on anxiety, bipolar disorder, and Alzheimer's. The Women's Health Initiative at MIND, or WIM, which is investigating cannabis for gynecological pain, menopause, and endometriosis. Concerns about mislabeled cannabis products and unregulated hemp-derived products, and more. Before we get to my conversation with Stacy, I'd like to thank this episode's sponsor, Healer.com. Healer is a trusted, physician-developed medicinal cannabis brand founded to address the challenges of helping people and health providers get the best results with safe, reliably dosable products and education on how best to use them. Healer hemp products are available nationwide and include a step-by-step usage guide and response tracker. Healer's distinctive product formulations and education are based on the latest research and work of leading cannabis clinician, Dr. Dustin Sulak. For more information, visit healer.com or healercbd.com. Okay, and without any further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Staci Gruber. Good afternoon, Stacy. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
We are excited to have you on the podcast and thrilled to have you back at CanMed this year. I know that you were back with us way back at Harvard Medical School, and then came out to Pasadena as well. And then it took a few years off, but now we're excited to have you back. In your presentation, we'll share data from several clinical trials that you and your team are performing as part of the MIND program. So that's probably a good place to start. Tell us a bit about the MIND program, why it was founded, and how its 10 years of research have led you to this point.
Sure. Well, first, I will say this. I'm delighted to be heading back to CanMed this year. And yes, I was part of early CanMed meetings and thought, and still think it's really one of the best meetings there is. And I think it's a great opportunity to interact with people from lots of different areas related to cannabis and cannabinoid-based work. So the MIND program did just celebrate its 10-year anniversary, which seems odd to me. I will tell you, I spent several decades looking, among other things, at the impact of recreational cannabis on different aspects of function. So cognitive performance and clinical outcome, measures of brain structure and function, you name it. And we had done lots of different studies, again, looking at the impact of recreational cannabis. And when Massachusetts was on the precipice of legalizing medical cannabis, I scoured the literature. I thought, let me see, what do we know about the long-term effects of medical cannabis? Because as you probably know, cannabis was re-legalized in this country in 1996 in California. And despite that, interestingly enough, there really was nothing in the literature, nothing at all about long-term effects of medical cannabis use. I found some evidence for certain types of studies that looked at, sort of a quick and dirty, if you will, assessment of cognition as part of a different kind of very short type of study, but nothing that was long-term, nothing that followed patients over time, and certainly nothing that looked at cognition or clinical outcomes as a primary focus. And so I launched Marijuana Investigations for Neuroscientific Discovery, or the MIND program, with the singular focus of looking at the long-term impact of medical cannabis use. And at the time, I think a number of people were sort of like, well, you can do what you can try to look at these folks over time, but these are primarily recreational people who are really just looking for a legal way to use cannabis. And I first and foremost, I would say that was absolutely positively untrue. I knew it then, and I can really point to you and say, absolutely, it's not true. So it's been an extremely important program. I think it's still the only one like it in the country. And it's home to what we call a number of firsts. We were the first ever to do long-term assessments. So we look at patients before they begin using medical cannabis. And that's really important. So people who have different types of indications or conditions, whether it's chronic pain, anxiety or mood disruption, sleep disruption, you name it. But we look at them before they begin using medical cannabis products, and then we follow them over time. They use any and all products they would like to use. And we have those products analyzed by an outside lab. So we know, quote, what's in your weed. That's because it's not a clinical trial and I'm not controlling what's given to them. But then we can, of course, look at their exposure to different cannabinoids over time, which is incredibly helpful. In the meantime, we're looking at primary outcomes like chronic pain, like mood, like sleep, and then, of course, measures of cognitive performance and, thankfully, measures of brain structure, function, quality of life, etc. And I think that, again, some of these firsts that MIND has sort of been fortunate enough to put on the map should be really just what I would call the beginning of the story, right? This is just the tip of the iceberg. So yes, we're the first ever to look at long-term outcome and cognitive performance, and first ever to do imaging, first to do some of these clinical trials, all of which are informed by these long-term observational studies. They tell us the directions that we need to focus on. Patients have always been our greatest source of information. They lead the way. We follow them, which is a little backwards in terms of medicine, right? It's not usual, but we do it. So it's been an incredibly rewarding time. And I think the program is unbelievably helpful and now has really expanded. So it's been a great journey so far.
Great. So you mentioned there was a lack of long-term studies. How long are we talking?
So in terms of the types of longitudinal studies that we're doing,
Yeah.
so if you look at the literature, again, we were looking at legalization here in Massachusetts in 2012, and there was nothing in literature. Our first studies were designed to look at individuals up to 1 year. And again, I had a lot of people say, good luck, they'll never stay. Well, we have the opposite problem, which is that once we begin looking at people over time and establish relationships, and people come in and we have these very comprehensive assessments, they're interested in staying connected. So we started off looking at outcome between baseline and 3 months, 6 months, 12 months. And every month, our team contacts them and we get an idea of what they're using, how they're using, frequency, magnitude, all that stuff. But these in-depth assessments at the milestone visits, then we went out to 2 years, then 3 years. Now we're following people all the way out to 5 years, which is
Wow.
amazing, amazing. So that's really lucky.
Excellent. And so what are you finding with some of these long-term studies?
The first longitudinal observational study was pretty general. I didn't want to limit it to people with any specific indication, although I had thought about it, like maybe just folks with pain or just folks with anxiety. We are a psychiatric hospital. This is what we do 24/7, right? All psychiatry all the time. But I thought opening it up, again, the top three conditions for medical cannabis use in this country are chronic pain, anxiety, and mood disruption, and then sleep. And that's actually what we see in our cohorts. And I would tell you that the most interesting sort of big take-home messages from the longitudinal observational studies so far is that first and foremost, in terms of people before they begin using their medical cannabis regimen and over time, generally do not perform worse on cognitive tasks. In fact, they look, if anything, they look stable or slightly better.
Hmm.
From a clinical perspective, which is the most important thing, right? We're looking at how they do and how they feel. Self-report measures are helpful. Examiner-driven measures are helpful, but really this is primarily up to what they think and how they feel. They generally report having less chronic pain, having less anxiety, less sleep disruption, so easier to fall asleep, better sleep coherence or the ability to stay asleep. That's interesting. Also, hugely important, we do see a drop in conventional medication use. Again, this isn't me saying, hey, listen, now that you're on medical cannabis, you should stop with the opioids. No. This is the folks doing it on their own. These are medical cannabis patients who say, I don't need the same level of oxy that I did. I don't actually need any of that drug or this drug at all. And so all we're doing is really, I always say, I'm just your faithful scribe. We're just keeping track. We're writing, right? We're just following you over time. So these precipitous drops in opioids, over-the-counter analgesics or pain relievers, and benzodiazepines, which people often use for things like anxiety or sleep, really interesting to see them drop. Again, no one's asking them to do it. It's on their own. So that's pretty impressive. In the pain realm, we certainly see folks having less chronic pain and less disruption from pain in terms of how much their pain distresses them or disrupts their lives, how much they feel it's a disability. So that's pretty interesting. We don't see the same thing in we have a patient group that we call treatment as usual. So these are patients with the same indications and conditions as our medical cannabis patients, but who aren't using medical cannabis. We follow those folks over time too. It's a great comparison group, right? So they have chronic pain or anxiety or sleep disorder, whatever they have. We don't really see the same pattern of change over time in those groups.
So they're not using cannabis to treat their
right.
their symptoms.
Right. So within subjects, we see changes, right, between baseline and 3 months, 6 months, 12 months. And then when you look at the aggregate group of medical cannabis patients compared to treatment as usual, you don't really see the same patterns. So interesting.
Interesting. No, and you mentioned too that you're just a scribe and you're just sort of notating what the patients are doing. So you don't give any recommendations in terms of dosage or anything like that?
So that becomes a really interesting set of questions with patients. And of course, individuals who have a fair amount of expertise and knowledge in cannabis and cannabinoid-based therapies, of course we should be the ones helping people when they don't know what to do. In general, patients decide on their own regimens and they may get advice or feedback on the types of products, but it's not a situation, and actually, I believe it violates federal law for any of us to say, listen, this is how you should take it, what you should take it, where you can't really do that. So we may provide some types of feedback, but in terms of guidance, they're generally choosing the types of products that they're interested in using. We may help guide them with regard to specific questions that they have. How do I avoid having this? I don't want to be high. I would just like to relax. I definitely don't want to be high because I have this. Okay. Maybe you're looking for a product that's not exclusively high in THC. So these kinds of things, but it's never a specific, here's what to do and how to do it. I can go to jail for that. And if orange weren't the new black, it would be a different story.
So are you finding that, certain indications gravitate towards certain formulations of cannabinoids?
So I think that in general, there are some perceptions in sort of among the general public, like, if I have chronic pain, I have to have a product that has this amount of, let's say, THC or this ratio of THC to CBD. And people often think that it's going to be more of a one size fits all than it really winds up being. So many individual factors come into play here, right? So your own experience with cannabis or cannabinoids, what other medications you take, because there are some pretty stunning potential drug-drug interactions. And anything that's swallowed, we worry about that, right? Because once we digest it, it has to pass through the liver and things are converted into other compounds. Genetic liabilities. So do you have a first degree relative who has a history of psychosis? We want to be careful about super high THC products or even high THC products. So I think there's a lot to be mindful of. That said, I think people are generally very interested, at least in our studies, in not necessarily being intoxicated. I say this because we developed a metric called can account. Get it? Can account, like can account, where we can actually quantify individual cannabinoid exposure. So regardless of the product type, whether it's an oil or an edible or a vape cartridge, we can quantify how much of each of the cannabinoids you might be exposed to in a given week, depending on how much and how often you use. If you look at that data over time, overwhelmingly, these folks are exposed to more non-intoxicating cannabinoids like CBD than THC. So they're not really looking exclusively to be. So that's interesting. I think we're seeing more and more of that. People would like to feel better, but not necessarily to not feel like themselves. So,
Yeah. No, one of the things you mentioned too that kind of stood out, and I know that there's been some talk recently on social media, and I know that our chief science officer has sort of weighed in on it as well, is that there's kind of this growing how do I phrase it? There's a growing concern about using too much cannabis leading to psychiatric disorders like schizophrenia or things like that. And I know that you mentioned whether or not someone has a history or a family history of that. Just wondering, I mean, given your expertise, if you want to weigh in on sort of what the risks are there.
so that probably is its own show. We should do our own show. We take this on the road, the two of
Let's
us.
start over.
We're gonna take this on the road. I think there's a lot to be mindful of. Listen, there is no question that cannabis and cannabinoids, if you ask me, have remarkable therapeutic potential across the board. Depending on who you are, where you are in life, what else you're using, quote, what's in your weed, all these things that matter. Overwhelmingly, when we think of risk factors, we think of individuals who are more likely vulnerable. So our first and foremost, the group that leaps to mind and everybody, for everybody, adolescents and emerging adults, where we have a neurodevelopmental vulnerability. The brain is, for my cannabis audiences, their brains are half baked. They're not quite done, under construction, whatever euphemism you want, the brain's not done. And so like any other substance, not just cannabis, but other substances, alcohol, illness, injury, brain is vulnerable. And so exposure to different types of things during that period of time may result in something that's not necessarily optimal. It does appear that the presence of THC may impact neuronal trajectories during development. It's possible. I mean, there's all sorts of things that have been discussed and assessed, and it does appear that high amounts of different types of cannabinoids during this vulnerable time may not result in the most optimal outcome. Is it true for everybody? Probably not. Where do we draw the line? How much is okay? Who knows? Everybody is different. It depends on the age. It depends on so many things. I think we also are mindful on the other end of the age spectrum, right? So the
Mm.
fastest growing group of cannabis consumers across this country, individuals over 60 or 65. So we're mindful. So now we have slowed metabolism. Individuals in that age bracket are generally on several conventional medications, somewhere between 3 and 5. So drug-drug interactions are a thing. And we're mindful of clearance. So I think when we think of the risks, we want to take a big picture look. In terms of psychosis and psychiatric disorders and conditions, I think that there's been a fair amount that's been published with regard to the fact that there appear to be associations between cannabis use and different psychiatric conditions, symptoms, or clusters, not necessarily causation. Exacerbation of
Right.
symptoms, sure. Causation, not so much, right? So, and that's really important. And I think people don't always hear that part of the message. Just because they're associated, sometimes people who don't necessarily feel so great or comfortable in their own skin are more likely to use things to, quote, escape their current state of being or to feel different. That doesn't
Mhm.
mean that that's what caused it, right? So important distinction.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. So kind of, I guess, kind of circling up on the longitudinal or observational studies, what are the limitations of these sort of studies?
Longitudinal studies or observational studies in general have lots of limitations, including the most obvious, which is that you can't necessarily always say that what you're seeing that's different over time is a result of just cannabis. Sometimes people implement or sort of start a new cannabis or medical cannabis regimen, and at the same time they're also doing other things potentially that we wouldn't know about. How do I know it's just the medical cannabis? You don't. So you do your best to control for everything else. We ask that people don't start other medications or this or that. You do your best. Um, it's not as powerful or as clear cut as a clinical trial, where we're looking at a specific study drug or series of study drugs, right, that I have formulated. In the case of my clinical trials, I formulate the actual products used. In observational studies, usually patients are using whatever they choose to use. And it's great that we can actually get laboratory analyses of, quote, what's in their weed. But it would be a little bit better if we knew sort of a priori what we were giving and how.
Mm.
And we're looking at something before and then after. So it's a little less clear. But that said, I mean, again, these longer term studies really give us a trajectory of what people look like over time. And interestingly enough, individuals in our clinical trials very often wind up signing up for the observational study. So we get to see those people long term and how they do after being on a clinical trial
Mm.
and then sort of migrating or evolving into a different type of therapy, maybe a more conventional therapy or a medical cannabis product that's in the marketplace and what they look like. So you can actually compare them. That's interesting. But there's shortcomings with every type of approach. You do the best that you can.
Sure.
But I tell you this, if you don't look, you don't know. And I have a very strongly held belief that real world patients using real world products give us a really good sense of real world outcome.
Yeah.
And that type of data helps guide me when I'm thinking of the next stage for clinical trials. Like, ooh, patients say they're using this and not that, and here's why. We should be thinking about this. Or a lot of folks complain about this, this, this. We should look at that. They're, again, they really are guiding the charge in many cases, as opposed to somebody discovering something, at their bench and going, "Ooh, we should try this in this population." Patients are doing it. We go, "We should look at that."
Mm.
Um,
So you've mentioned a few times that you're actually testing the products that the patients are using. Now, is that each time that they get a new product, or how frequently is this
It's a
testing?
great question. So that's been a bit more variable. So we tend to test their most commonly used products. So patients very often, again, our real medical cannabis patient cohort that says, look, I have XYZ 1, 2, 3. I'm looking to treat these symptoms. And if they find something that works, which generally happens, but as you probably know, there's a little bit of trial and error. You
Hmm.
wouldn't sample that necessarily. You may want to get it when they have a regimen that really does seem to be consistent and that they feel is helpful. Otherwise, you're looking at nothing but sort of change over time. Do we test every time? Of course not. No, it'd
Yeah.
be great. I mean, if I could somehow, give every single person some kind of, benchtop thing that gave me a printout of exactly what that'd be amazing. It doesn't work that way. So we do our best. It's still better than what we had, which was, oh yeah, nothing.
Okay.
So, I think that's better. My least favorite thing to find in the literature by some of the most esteemed colleagues I could ever imagine is that people will ask questions about individuals' cannabis use, but they never ask about the actual constituents within the products. That's a problem.
Mm.
Because no matter what you're seeing, good or bad, we don't necessarily know what's always driving that. And when you ask patients or recreational consumers to guesstimate, my favorite question, well, tell us what you think. I mean, do you think it was strong weed? Have you ever met anybody who says, yeah, I have really crap weed, it's awful, garbage? No one says I have ditch weed. No one. But it's sort of like other things that people may overestimate, if you know what I mean. It can't always be true. So it would be great if when people say we're looking at, very high THC product use in this cohort, that you actually confirm their products are in fact very high in THC. I haven't seen that too often. Sometimes, more recently, we're seeing some of that, but that's a limitation in the field for sure.
Excellent. All right. So moving on to the clinical trials, as we mentioned, you have a number of different clinical trials that are going on looking at things like anxiety, bipolar disorder, Alzheimer's related dementia. So, hoping you could share some details about that. I know you're going to be talking about it at CanMed, so you probably don't want to give away too much, but
Sure.
what you are willing to share,
Sure.
please.
Oh, I'm willing to share plenty. So, our very first clinical trial was designed to look at patients with moderate to severe anxiety, and it was designed to be a whole plant, full spectrum product with a relatively high amount of CBD compared for sure to THC, but not no THC, not a broad spectrum product, but a full spectrum product. And it was designed to be a relatively short trial. We actually wound up having 3 arms. So it's a whole plant full spectrum product and a placebo, and then an actual isolate that comes from that base. Now that's a challenge. So not just any old isolate that's CBD, right? An actual CBD isolate that came from the same base from which the study product. That study is wrapping. We just enrolled our last patient. We've published the open label data, which I will review probably at CanMed. But that was the very first one. And it's been a really, really important study or set of studies. The open label really helped to inform the double blind phase. We then did the same type of study with an industry partner using a hemp-based product that we're in the process of writing up now with regard to open label. Anxiety features into so many different conditions. It's a really important thing to assess in people with lots of different either general medical conditions or psychiatric conditions, right? It's not just primary anxiety. It's people with, for example, patients with glioblastoma, an incurable brain tumor, right? Incredibly serious and lethal. We're looking at chronic pain and anxiety, and then an exploratory aim is tumor progression, because if we've done it right, maybe, knock on wood, maybe we'll help to slow or even stop the progression of the disease. There's every indication based on preclinical work that is potentially possible here. We have the very first study of patients with bipolar disorder using a whole plant broad spectrum product. So, I think there's lots of different ways to get at this, and I think there's so many different areas of interest these days, and so much of them, or so many of them, overlap and intersect, but they are different. And we've certainly learned a lot. In patients who have Alzheimer's related dementia, very often they do have anxiety, along with other things. And how does that necessarily, how can a product that's high in CBD that maybe contains some THC but not a ton, although some people like a lot of THC in that population, how do those folks look over a period of time? All of these things, it's important to have empirically sound data. So that's why we do it.
Yeah. So how did you go about, kind of deciding what the formulation would be for some of these indications?
Great question. So for the first one, I knew I had actually come across a product in California that I thought would be particularly promising, that actually is a cannabis-based product, but would have met the definition at that time for hemp. This is way back when, way. And when I wrote my first IND and was approved by the FDA and our IRB, I mean, this is a long time ago. That product would have met the definition of industrial hemp, and the DEA came along and said, this is great, we think we can approve, except you can't use that. I mean, it's not like you could go to a candy machine and say, instead of a Snickers, I'm going to get a Kit Kat. Nope. So you have to go back to the drawing board. I knew that I wanted something that was a whole plant full spectrum product, given the likely impact of some of the so-called minor cannabinoids. And the question was how to do it in such a way that would be palatable, tolerable, and likely efficacious. That was the big question. And, whether you're going to use an emulsion or an infusion, like, all these things. And, I'm a neuroscientist. I'm not a chemist necessarily by trade, although I spend a lot of time now with compounds and chemicals, and it's been some of the most glorious work I've ever done, and it's so exciting. But really, it has to do with trying to understand how to best leverage some of these naturally occurring compounds. So the whole goal of MIND with regard to the clinical trials arm is to sort of explore, and the term exploit sounds unfortunately negative, but to really leverage the potential therapeutics of these compounds and reduce risk and harm. So we don't really want people super altered. In many cases, they really can't be. And so that's sort of the trick. Mitigate risk and harm, but increase the likelihood of clinical efficacy.
Right. So high CBD. I mean, if you're saying that it would have kind of fit the definition for industrial hemp, then it's below that 0.3% THC, right?
So our first study was conducted using a product that I created that has, you could have had 10 times the amount of THC in that product and still been below the limit. After 4 weeks, half of my sample tested positive for THC on urinary drug assays. So they would have failed a urine screen. Not one of them, of course, was intoxicated or altered, sort of underscoring the importance of why we can't use a per se law. For example, like the presence of this means they're intoxicated or impaired. No, of course not. Of course it doesn't. Not one person reported feeling altered or intoxicated or altered at all. But yes, that product is technically cannabis, but it just so happens to have extremely low levels of THC. But trust me when I tell you, it was sourced. My original thing was sourced by NIDA. They didn't give me anything that was turnkey. I had to make it. They gave me it was a rather sludgy oil-based product. That was a challenge, I would say, diplomatically. This is a family-friendly show. It was a challenge to work with, and so that was not the easiest thing ever. But we did wind up making it into a sublingual tincture. My feeling is sublingual tinctures are probably the way to go for these things. At least that's been where we've spent a fair amount of time because of the increased bioavailability that's afforded that way, as opposed to taking a capsule or just swallowing something. So.
Interesting. So have you encountered any regulatory or logistical? I mean, I think you mentioned some of the logistical hurdles, but regulatory hurdles.
I mean, the fact that they said, the FDA, once the FDA approves it, the IND, then you have to actually post your clinical trial information on something called clinicaltrials.gov. And patients who are rather desperate across the country are, sort of living on these sites. And they'll call you and sign up and say, let me in, let me in. The IRB had approved it, but of course the DEA said, not so fast, Gruber. So that was a bit of a challenge and a rather untenable position to have been placed in because you have patients who are desperate. I have product that's made, but I can't use it. Can't use it. Couldn't use any of it. I still have it on the top shelf of my office because it's a reminder. Never count your chickens. It took, a quick, just a quick, what was it, almost 2 years from that point until we actually enrolled our first patient when I had to go back to the drawing board and start over. I would say that was a little bit of a hurdle. Certainly a mogul. Was that the thing? Listen, we have had extremely good and positive interactions with each of the agencies, and they've been very helpful. I think for many, many reasons, there was a lot of learning that had to happen on both sides. I think I understood a little bit better than they did. I tried to help them along, and it took a long time, and we're still not really where we need to be. I don't think that's any surprise, but that was a bit of a challenge, to be honest. A bit of a challenge. Yeah.
And then you mentioned you're sort of comparing the full spectrum products to the isolates. What sort of differences and results are you seeing there?
So we haven't actually analyzed that data. As I mentioned, we just enrolled our last patient. So I don't know. My feeling is that a whole plant full spectrum product would be more efficacious relative to placebo for sure, and likely more efficacious than the isolate form. And an isolate from that same distillate, which is not at all what you see when you see isolate arms. It's completely, and they're like, and people say, well, it's the same, doesn't matter where you get it. I don't think necessarily that's true. So that would be my guess, but I don't know. Certainly we see a lot of clinical benefit in individuals who are using a whole plant full or broad spectrum relative to people who are using, quote, just CBD or just something else. Probably for good reasons mechanistically, probably.
Excellent. I did want to ask you about the Women's Health Initiative at Mind. It's mentioned in
Yeah.
your abstract as something that you guys are looking into or sort of
Yes.
expanding into.
Yeah.
So please share about that and sort of what conditions you're looking at there.
Yeah, WHIM, or the Women's Health Initiative at Mind. I just wanted something that was catchy where I could say not just a whim. So, over a
You're
billion,
always with the puns. I love
I
it.
try, I really try. Over a billion individuals are affected by things like gynecologic pain in this country. It's largely understudied. This is an underserved population for a million different reasons. And there are lots of reasons to explore the potential application of cannabis and cannabinoids in these conditions. For example, we did a number of survey-based studies. These were my first real survey-based studies. I had done a little bit of work in this area before, but they come in with perimenopausal, menopausal, and postmenopausal disruption and things like cannabis or cannabinoids. We did a survey study that was a bit of an adjacent clinical investigation, individuals who are using a commercially available vaginal suppository for menstrual-related dysfunction. And we now have our very first project that's funded to look at women with endometriosis using a whole plant full spectrum product that I made for folks with endometriosis and related pain. So there's a lot of interest here, and people are using these products. The problem that I often hear about is patients will tell you, I don't know, my friend used this, so I figured I'll just try. Well, wouldn't it be great to actually have data that could help individuals be informed about what products they should and maybe shouldn't be exploring? I don't know, just a thought. So that's I think a rather exciting area. Again, endometriosis is one of those conditions that so many are affected by. So many are affected by.
Yeah.
And the number of symptoms is rather staggering when you really start looking at the data. And so if you can improve the quality of life and you can reduce discomfort and increase people's ability to sleep and be less, again, either less anxious or have less pain or all of the above, why wouldn't you try?
No, it's interesting you mentioned endometriosis. We did have a presenter last year who talked about that, and it was sort of more exploratory of, could cannabinoids potentially be a good treatment option? And it sounds like now you're actually investigating that. So that's fantastic.
There's every reason to think so, given the relationship between the endocannabinoid system, this endogenous system, chemicals and receptors throughout the brain and body, and the gynecologic system, right? So again, when we think of the ways that we're all sort of wired, why wouldn't you try to harness the most powerful things that you could that are potentially less invasive or less, quote, disruptive to other things? If it isn't likely to do a ton of harm and could potentially help, I'm all for trying to see what we get. So
Excellent. All right. All right. I do want to be mindful of your time, Stacy. So one of the questions I kind of wanted to maybe kind of conclude with is with all the work that you've done from studying medical cannabis patients, what lessons have you learned that should maybe inform public policy or regulations going forward?
I think one of the most important things that leaps to mind, and a number of my very esteemed colleagues and friends have published on this as well. Very often people are invested, and I mean literally and figuratively, in buying products that are designed to help with this or that. And they spend lots of money. And unfortunately, we know that what is on the label isn't necessarily what's contained in the product. It's a problem. It's a problem because the quote, what's in your weed factor should translate to, hey, it's supposed to be 50 mg per mil. It should have around that, right? So for people who are on a super fixed budget, I'm thinking of our older cohorts. We have a very large older adult study that we did for a year. These people scrounge and save to buy these products that are sometimes, north of $100, $150 an ounce. And they wind up containing very little active cannabinoid. There's very little in terms of real cannabinoids. On the other side, in terms of what shouldn't be in there, right? Aflatoxins, heavy metals, mold, yeast. I think that it's important for people to be mindful of the safety and sort of the oversight that we do need to have with some of these products. It's important. That's a big one. I think, again, the same rules and concerns for individuals who are vulnerable at, let's say, our, the earlier age folks who are exploring cannabis or cannabis, and we're mindful of their brain and this developmental vulnerability. It doesn't appear that we have the same quote story that gets translated over the lifespan. So individuals who come to cannabis late in life, older adults who are, let's just say, beyond the period of vulnerability. Right now, on the other side, so brain's fully developed. Now we're losing things because we're older. It doesn't appear that there's the same potential decrements in, for example, cognitive performance that we spend decades documenting in our recreational consumers. Our older medical cannabis folks sometimes not only look stable, they look better.
Mm,
We see structural brain changes after the initiation of medical cannabis products. So I think that's really interesting. So how that will shake out in terms of public policy will be interesting. There's certainly lots of very strongly held opinions and thoughts about that these days. So it'll be interesting to see.
sure, that amongst other things. No, and you mentioned
We should let science guide the conversations though, no?
that
As
does sound like a good idea.
let the not your thoughts and your feelings, what you think and how you feel, but what the actual data show us. I think that's important.
Absolutely. No, and you make a good point about, the concerns of is what's on the label really in your product? And make sure there's other contaminants. And I just have to think of the conversations I've been having with folks about hemp-derived cannabinoid products and how they're not as regulated. And they may be more available, they may be more affordable, but there's a risk there.
So there's two things, right, in the hemp space. One, you're exactly right. There's little to no regulation, and we certainly should have some oversight. In the meantime, patients and consumers should be asking for COAs, like, know before you go. What are you looking for? What's the goal of use? And then ask for a COA so you know what's in your weed. So a certificate of analysis that's, quote, matched to the batch, not just any old COA that
Right.
came 3 years ago from some product that's made by the same company. The actual product you have in your hand, they should really have. And more responsible and well-respected vendors really do have that available. I'll also tell you that, for the majority of cannabis-based dispensaries, they don't really spend most of their real estate in the high CBD product arena, right?
Exactly.
Because that's not where their consumer base is headed. That people are going online for things like that. So I think it would be helpful to have people understand what to expect and how to make their best decisions, really.
Excellent. And now we mentioned that you're joining us for CanMed down in Puerto Rico, and we're super excited to have you.
Right.
So I did want to ask you, are there any certain types of professionals or researchers or attendees that you're looking forward to connecting with at
A
CanMed?
great question. So again, CanMed always brings together this rather remarkable constellation of people from different walks of life and different aspects of this particular world. I always find it really rewarding. It's always great to talk to our partner sort of clinicians and colleagues. It's amazing. And we all share these stories and we all agree this is such an important area. We can't not do it, even though it's really hard and getting harder, but we all do it. It's incredibly important to join forces with what I would call the responsible industry-based folks, right? It's the way that I feel about research and clinical work. In the best of all possible worlds, clinical work is informed by research breakthroughs. But research breakthroughs are based on clinical needs that emerge through pure clinical work, right? So it's the same thing. And I think that if you're lucky, you have folks in industry who are invested literally and figuratively
Mm,
in joining forces with responsible scientists and clinician scientists who say, look, this is where I see something. I have this idea or thought, maybe there's a way to partner, because very often it's really challenging to get these things funded to move forward. You can have the best ideas in the world. If you can't implement them, they just sit on a shelf. So, and we know that the ways that these things move forward most effectively and most quickly is usually through private initiatives or industry, right? It's not necessarily the infrastructure that is our government partners to start. That's not how the MIND program started, for sure. So,
absolutely. Yeah. So making those connections, that's the goal.
yeah, for
All
sure.
right, Stacy, One last thing before I let you go, I want to give you the opportunity to plug any websites, social media, or any other resources that you think the folks who are listening or watching might be interested in if they want to learn more about the work that you're doing.
Sure. We do have a website. It's themindprogram.org or just drstacigruber.com. I think we'll get you there too. On Twitter and Instagram, I guess it's X, don't say Twitter. On X and I guess Instagram too, it's the same at Dr. Staci Gruber. I'm in conversation, I think, with Tommy Chong of Cheech and Chong about the importance of understanding the scientific sort of rationale behind cannabis.
Very cool.
That's a week from a week. It's actually this coming Monday, which is a holiday here in Massachusetts, but that'll be in Los Angeles. So I think you can live stream it, but it'll be an interesting conversation for sure. I have no doubt. So
Excellent. We will share those links in the show description and try to share the link to that discussion too. That sounds like fun.
right? I mean, that's, I was asked, would you like to have a conversation with Tommy? I mean, how can the answer you think, but yes, of course I would. Sure.
Of course.
Absolutely, I would. So, yeah.
Very cool. All right, Stacy, thanks again for the time and really looking forward to seeing you down in Puerto Rico.
Thank you. It's going to be great to be back. Thanks for the time.